Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Tex Messages. They're just text messages. I'm the parasite of the show, Rick Tex. We're glad to be broadcasting from central Minnesota. And of course, there happens to be a bit of a snowstorm outside, but that's the reality that we live in. Ironically, last week, it was about 70, 60 degrees out. Overnights, maybe dropped to 50. And now the last couple days, it looks like it'll be single-digit lows for the evening, but that's whether that's weather modification or not, it's very difficult to tell. Because, the signs of weather manipulation do seem to be apparent, but, to what magnitude that the weather could actually be manipulated is really debatable, unless you're part of some intelligence circle that has vast knowledge and esoteric understanding of how it works. But as peasants, there's really no way to accurately ascertain that or not. Now, one thing we wanted to discuss this evening was the hottest topic lately is voter fraud. Now, voter fraud has basically been around since the dawn of time. If you look, Abraham Lincoln's elections, they spoke of voter fraud there and mail-in ballots and all this goofy stuff. And as far as electronic voting goes, in 2000, there's a very contested presidential race between Mr. Al Gore and George W. Bush. Not George H.W. Bush, the younger one. And what they ultimately concluded is that Florida went to George W. Bush. And since the weird thing about electronic voting, since electronic voting has become a thing, there have been very balanced elections. Like, for instance, if a certain president wins, he or she generally doesn't win the popular vote, which seems to be something that is a very excellent tool in the divide and conquer strategy that can be inflicted upon the population. For example, if one president were to win with 80% of the vote, that would not be a very good way to divide and conquer. But if you can create some illusionary means of voting numbers that say so-and-so got 48% of the vote, so-and-so else got 45% of the vote, so-and-so wins. And then, someone else will say, well, we got a lot of support here, so we must be on the right path. Now, whether that's consistent with reality or not is very difficult to determine in this congruent abstract that we're illustrating here. But the fact of the matter is, there was this company called Diebold, and they've since spun off into this, that, and the other thing, and they've basically probably vaporized into some other company. Sort of like IBM spun off Microsoft, and then Bill Gates took it over and basically taking over the world now. But Diebold, whether they're owned directly by Cheney, George W. Bush, or whatever the case may be, but there's some nefarious ownership connections there, and people were very suspect of it. And then the Florida controversy brought it, it fueled the catalyst that got people thinking. And unfortunately today, we're facing this voter fraud issue, and supposedly Sloppy Steve and Rudy Giuliani are going to be the saviors of taking it to the court systems and proving that there's fraud here, there, and everywhere. Ultimately, 2022, if we're not all dead from COVID, the elections will probably have the same type of fraud, and they'll basically be the same. Democrat, Republican will win. It'll be 50%, 51% of the vote goes to the winner, blah, blah, blah. Third parties won't ever see the light of day. And why do you think that is? Because every living, breathing creature pretty much has identified that anybody in, let's say, Congress, for example, is likely a criminal. Because if you think about it, they're paying millions and millions of dollars for a job that pays $125,000 a year with full health benefits. So let's say you're going to apply for a job at McDonald's, and it gets, let's say you're working full time and you get $30,000 a year. Would you pay $120,000 to get that job? Not likely. So at this point, every living creature, breathing, even inorganic creatures can probably recognize the fraud and the lack of integrity that goes on within the halls of our leadership. But as long as we sit around and grovel and lay down, that's typically how it's going to be. Because, there's really not, as an individual, it's pretty difficult to determine why exactly people are on this planet, what their purpose is. Obviously, everybody has unique skill sets, and they can do this, that, and the other thing, or they got to support this person, that person, or some four-legged animals. But the fact of the matter is, the important thing is to always just do the right thing. Now, is doing the right thing paying $150,000 for a job that pays $30,000 a year, yet somehow you become a multimillionaire? Generally, when things are done under the shadow of darkness, it's not really a good thing. Now, does that mean you should go shower out in public and breastfeed and crap in the park? Not necessarily, because there are some things that people are just not interested in seeing. But as a taxpayer funded or fraud or reserve funded branch of our leadership, a lot of people would be interested in knowing how somebody who was worth $50,000 prior to getting a job that pays $120,000 a year now all of a sudden becomes a multi-millionaire after doing that job for 12 years. That becomes a little bit fishy. Now, unfortunately, we don't really have all the answers here. And then there's always the burden of proof. As a peasant, how do you really prove anything? What you can prove is past statements. Like, for example, in 2017, you could say Anthony Fauci said that Donald Trump will be faced with a surprise infectious outbreak, which obviously wasn't a surprise if he said it was. So you can say he said that in 2017. You can show the video. You can also show a video around March 9th, 2020, when he said that everyone's free and safe to travel. Those are things you can prove. Can you prove that Fauci has made backroom deals with the Wuhan lab and funded gain-of-function research into coronavirus? As a peasant, you can look at news reports that say it, and you can hope that they're credible organizations, but the proof is maybe not. It's sort of just making careful observations and then ascertaining what you feel in your heart is the accurate assessment. Now, when Bill Gates, for example, goes on TV and he says everybody needs to take this vaccine for a disease that has a 99.99% success survival rate, can you prove that you need or don't need to take the vaccine, or can you prove that the vaccine will be bad? One thing you can prove is that it has liability protection, as written out in the 1986 National Childhood Vaccine Act, that ironically was signed by Reagan right after Anthony Fauci came in his position as whatever he was, I don't know, World Health Organization, something or another. But the reality is, generally, we're always going to be getting the shaft of the matter. But the challenge is just to recognize the fraud and to try to call it out at all avenues. That includes voter fraud, white coat fraud that's done under the cover of darkness, and fraud that's been memory hold. Because as long as people have a memory, then that makes it more difficult for the masters to exercise their tyrannical controls. And it also makes it more difficult for people to use the most ridiculous measures of safety to be employed upon a international-wide population. So there's always that to consider. Now, in conclusion, we were thinking about adding an extra segment to the show. it would be interesting notions with Armis. And we haven't quite got Armis off his planet yet, but we're hoping to get him off there and hopefully get him on the show and have a segment with him and just to see how things go, because he would bring a contradictory viewpoint. He's very set in his ways, so there's not a lot of malleability, but it is good to have alternative viewpoints, because you can easily call something or someone stubborn, but if they have a lot of conviction in what it is they're thinking or doing or acting, it's generally through years of observation or lack of observation. So being stubborn in and of itself isn't such a bad thing. It's the path that's taken to the stubbornness that is whether it is a bad thing or not. So yeah, we may have the interesting notions with Armis, but we're going to have to conclude the show tonight, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us at Tex Messages. It's November 12, 2020, and we'll be back soon. Thank you.